Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Manga Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Ethan Miller had always believed that the strength of a marriage lay in trust. At 38, he cherished the life he'd built with Natalie, the woman he'd loved since their whirlwind romance in their 20s. Their suburban home was filled with laughter, shared memories, and dreams for the future. Or so he thought. That trust began to erode one quiet autumn evening. Ethan, nursing a late cup of coffee, heard the faint sound of laughter wafting from the living room. He set his mug down and moved toward the doorway, his steps hesitant. Natalie sat curled up on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear, the glow illuminating her amused smile. "Come on, Jared. You know how much I loved that song," she said, her voice light and teasing. Ethan froze. Jared. The name conjured images he'd buried. A lean, confident man from Natalie's past, her college boyfriend. Ethan knew she'd occasionally exchanged pleasantries with Jared on social media, but her laughter now, the softness in her tone, it wasn't casual. It felt like something more. "Ethan?" Natalie's voice startled him from his thoughts. He realized too late he was standing in the doorway, his shadow casting long across the room. "Couldn't sleep," Ethan replied evenly, masking the storm brewing inside. He gestured toward the kitchen. "Just getting some water." She offered a distracted smile, covering the phone's mouthpiece. "Be right there." As Ethan retreated, his mind raced. In their years together, Natalie had always been transparent, or so he believed. Yet recently, her phone rarely left her side, and she seemed lost in thought more often than usual. That night, as Natalie slipped into bed and drifted off, Ethan sat awake, piecing together fragments of a puzzle he didn't want to exist. He thought of the way she lingered over her phone, her laughter during conversations he wasn't privy to, and the way her gaze seemed to avoid his during those moments. The next morning, as Natalie chattered about an upcoming work event, Ethan feigned a casual tone. "Who were you talking to last night? You seemed to be enjoying yourself." Natalie's hand faltered briefly over her coffee cup, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, just Jared. We ran into each other online, and he called to catch up. Nothing serious." Her explanation was plausible, even friendly, but it left a residue of doubt Ethan couldn't shake. He knew his wife, her tells, her subtle shifts in energy, and this was something different. Over the next week, Ethan observed without accusation, her phone always angled away from his line of sight, her smiles to herself when she thought he wasn't looking. What had begun as a thread of suspicion was slowly unraveling into a tangle of uneasy questions. By the time Natalie announced a last-minute trip to visit her sister for the weekend, Ethan knew he needed answers. And so, quietly and methodically, he began taking steps to uncover the truth, determined to protect the life he thought he had. Ethan's approach was deliberate. He wasn't a man prone to impulsive decisions, and this situation demanded clarity. Over the next few days, he observed Natalie more closely, his calm exterior hiding a growing storm within. He replayed every instance of her distracted behavior, every vague explanation, and every shift in her energy. Something was wrong, and Ethan needed to understand the extent of it. The weekend of Natalie's trip arrived quickly. As she packed her overnight bag with meticulous care, Ethan watched from the doorway, his mind turning over possibilities. "Do you need me to drop you off?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "No need. Rachel's picking me up," Natalie replied, referencing her sister. Ethan nodded, his expression neutral, though her answer only deepened his suspicion. In the years they had been together, Rachel had never once arrived unannounced for a pickup. His gut told him this was another carefully curated detail in Natalie's growing web of half-truths. When her car disappeared down the driveway, Ethan wasted no time. He started with her laptop, hoping to find an answer among the flurry of work emails or browser history. However, Natalie's digital presence was unusually sparse, almost too sparse. The absence of anything incriminating felt like its own form of evidence, as though she had scrubbed away every trace of something she didn't want him to find. Undeterred, Ethan turned his attention to the phone bill. Their shared plan made it easy to access call logs and text records, and within minutes his fears were confirmed. Jared's number appeared frequently, often late at night or early in the morning when Natalie assumed Ethan was asleep. The discovery stung, but Ethan didn't let his emotions cloud his next steps. Confronting Natalie outright would yield little, he reasoned. She would deny or deflect. Instead, he decided to document everything. By Monday, Ethan had met with a private investigator, a wiry man named Peter, who had seen countless cases like this. "It could just be an emotional affair," Peter offered, flipping through his notepad. "But if it's more, we'll find out." Ethan agreed, though he wasn't certain if knowing more would offer solace or only deepen his pain. Either way, he needed the truth. The week passed in a strange haze. Ethan played his role as the attentive husband, listening to Natalie recount her weekend at her sister's house, nodding at details he suspected were fabricated. Inside, though, he was a man preparing for battle, waiting for the moment when everything would come into focus. 2 days later, Peter delivered his initial findings. Jared and Natalie had met at a restaurant downtown, a place Ethan and Natalie used to frequent on special occasions. The investigator produced photos, Jared leaning across the table, his hand brushing hers, Natalie smiling in a way Ethan hadn't seen in months. It was painful evidence, but undeniable. Ethan stared at the images in silence, his mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Why had Natalie chosen to risk everything they had built? Peter interrupted his thoughts. "Do you want to proceed further? We can dig deeper." Ethan nodded. "I need everything." While Peter worked to uncover more, Ethan took quiet measures to disentangle their lives. He opened a private bank account, rerouting his direct deposits and changing passwords on his personal accounts. He began cataloging shared assets, making notes of what would need to be divided if things came to that. At home, Ethan maintained his composure, though every interaction with Natalie felt increasingly surreal. Her laughter at the dinner table, her casual remarks about their weekend plans, it all felt like a performance in a play Ethan had already seen behind the scenes. He found himself growing more introspective, reflecting on the man he had been before Natalie, the man he had become with her, and the man he would need to be in the aftermath of whatever truth lay ahead. There was a time, years ago, when he believed their love was unshakable. Now, he could only wonder how many fractures had gone unnoticed before the foundation began to crumble. But if Natalie thought Ethan would be a passive participant in her betrayal, she had underestimated him. Quietly, methodically, Ethan was laying the groundwork for a future without her deceit. And as he stared at the images of her and Jared together, one thing became clear. He wasn't just fighting to preserve his dignity. He was fighting to reclaim his sense of self. Then had always prided himself on his composure. But as the truth about Natalie's relationship with Jared began to crystallize, he felt a quiet, simmering fury he had never experienced before. It wasn't just the betrayal that angered him. It was the layers of pretense and manipulation Natalie had woven into their lives. Yet even as the emotional weight pressed down on him, Ethan resolved to maintain his control. This wasn't a time for rash actions. It was a time for clarity and precision. By the end of the second week of Peter's investigation, the full scope of Natalie's duplicity had been laid bare. Jared and Natalie were not only in regular contact, but also meeting at least once a week, under the guise of work lunches, sisterly visits, and even a few urgent errands. The investigators' meticulous documentation painted a painful picture of a woman torn between two worlds, the one she had built with Ethan and the one she seemed eager to rekindle with her ex. Ethan's first instinct had been to confront Natalie immediately. He imagined himself demanding explanations, pressing her for answers to the questions that now haunted him. But deep down, he knew such a confrontation would achieve little. Natalie, when cornered, was skilled at turning the tables, a trait Ethan had previously admired as quick wit. He wouldn't allow her to manipulate the narrative. Instead, Ethan spent the next few days meticulously planning his response. If Natalie had taken their life together for granted, Ethan would remind her of the cost of betrayal, not with anger, but with quiet finality. It started with the house. Their home, nestled on a quiet suburban street, had always been a symbol of their shared dreams. They'd picked it out together, spending weeks debating floor plans and fixtures. Now, Ethan saw it differently, a structure that held too many memories, some of which now felt tainted. He contacted a realtor to explore valuations and began sorting through documents, noting everything from the mortgage terms to the furniture they'd bought during happy times. Ethan also met with a lawyer, a no-nonsense professional named Miriam Jacobs. She listened to his story with the kind of calm efficiency Ethan appreciated, taking notes and asking pointed questions. "Do you want to file for divorce immediately?" she asked. "Not yet," Ethan replied. "I need to make sure I've got everything in place first. This isn't just about leaving, it's about doing it on my terms." Over the next week, Ethan juggled work and his increasingly complex preparations. He began subtly withdrawing from Natalie emotionally, a fact she seemed to notice but didn't question openly. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. Instead, she carried on as though nothing had changed, her usual affectionate gestures feeling rehearsed and hollow. On a quiet Thursday evening, Natalie announced she'd be out late the following day for a team-building exercise with her coworkers. Ethan barely glanced up from his laptop, murmuring an acknowledgement that masked a torrent of thoughts running through his head. When Friday arrived, Ethan acted as though it were any other day. He kissed Natalie goodbye in the morning, even holding the door open for her as she left. But as soon as her car disappeared down the street, he began executing his plan. He called Peter, who confirmed what Ethan already suspected. Natalie wouldn't be at any team-building event that evening. Jared's name had appeared on her calendar again, this time alongside the address of a small hotel on the outskirts of town. Ethan didn't need to follow them to know what was happening. Instead, he focused on ensuring that Natalie would come home to the full weight of her decisions. He printed copies of the evidence Peter had gathered, pictures, call logs, and even a particularly damning text exchange where Natalie had expressed doubts about her marriage but gushed about Jared's charm. By the time evening came, Ethan was ready. The house was eerily quiet, the dim glow of the living room lamp casting long shadows. Ethan sat on the couch, the envelope of evidence beside him, waiting. It was well past midnight when Natalie returned. She stepped into the foyer with the practiced lightness of someone accustomed to sneaking in. Ethan remained seated, his presence only revealed when she turned and gasped at the sight of him. "You're up late?" she said, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Ethan gestured to the envelope on the coffee table. "We need to talk." Natalie hesitated, her hand tightening around her purse strap. "About what?" Ethan picked up the envelope and held it out. "This. Everything you've been hiding." Her face paled as she took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it and began flipping through the contents. With each page, her carefully constructed facade crumbled. "I can explain," she stammered, but Ethan shook his head. "No, Natalie, you don't get to explain. You've already said everything I need to hear, just not to me." The weight of her betrayal seemed to sink in as she sat down, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, Ethan felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of the pain she'd caused. "I trusted you," he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "And you threw it away." Natalie looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "I made a mistake." "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something hurtful in anger. What you did was deliberate. It was a choice, and now I'm making mine." Without another word, Ethan stood and left the room, leaving Natalie alone with the evidence of her deceit. Upstairs, he closed the bedroom door behind him, knowing he'd taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. Ethan had imagined countless scenarios for the aftermath of that night, but nothing prepared him for the stillness that followed. After he had left Natalie in the living room, the house seemed to hold its breath. He stayed in the guest room that night, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his chest. Sleep evaded him, each turn of his pillow doing little to quell the thoughts racing through his mind. By morning, the household routine resumed, though it felt like the air between them had shifted. Natalie moved carefully, as if navigating a minefield. Ethan watched her from across the breakfast table, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from what he assumed were hours of crying. She tried to speak a few times, but Ethan cut her off with a simple, "Not now." Ethan spent the day reflecting on what lay ahead. While he'd uncovered the truth and confronted Natalie, his path forward required careful thought. He wasn't just dismantling a marriage, he was taking apart the life they'd built together. The first step was ensuring he had the financial means to move on without complications. He met with Miriam, his lawyer, again, this time armed with the evidence he had collected. "You have a solid case," she said, flipping through the neatly organized folder Ethan handed her. "Emotional infidelity, potential misuse of marital funds if she spent money on Jarrett during these meetings. This will work in your favor." "What happens if she fights back?" Ethan asked. She can try, but the documentation you've gathered puts you in a strong position. You've been prudent in protecting yourself." And Miriam paused, folding her hands on the desk. "But let me ask you something. What do you want from this? A clean break? Revenge?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "I just want peace. I want to move forward without her lies following me." Miriam nodded. "Then we'll focus on that. A clear division of assets, no room for manipulation." As the legal proceedings took shape, Ethan turned his attention back to the house. He began sorting through their shared belongings, photographs, mementos, furniture they'd picked out together. Each item seemed to hold a fragment of their history, and letting go of some of them felt like tearing a piece of himself away. He packed what he needed into a few boxes and rented a small storage unit to keep them safe. The house would likely be sold, and he wanted to preserve only what truly mattered. Meanwhile, Natalie seemed to oscillate between denial and desperation. One evening, she tried to approach Ethan in the kitchen. "Ethan, please," she began, her voice trembling. "Can we talk? I can't bear this silence." Ethan turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Talk about what, Natalie? You've already said everything to Jared. What's left for me to hear?" Her eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I wasn't thinking straight." "You weren't thinking about us, that's for sure," Ethan replied, his tone sharp. "You were thinking about what you wanted, what you needed. You didn't care what it would cost." "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "But you did," Ethan said, stepping back. "And no amount of regret is going to change that. The only thing left to do now is figure out how we move forward, desperately." In the days that followed, Natalie seemed to retreat into herself. She spent hours in their bedroom, the door closed, as if shielding herself from the reality of what she had wrought. Ethan felt no satisfaction in her misery. If anything, it only deepened his sense of loss. This wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with, the one who had shared his dreams and promised to be by his side through life's trials. This was someone else, a stranger who had betrayed him. Then came the moment of decision. Miriam called to inform him that the papers were ready. That evening, Ethan presented Natalie with the document that would officially end their marriage. "You're serving me divorce papers?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "This is the only way forward." Natalie looked down at the papers, her hands shaking as she flipped through them. "You're really doing this?" she murmured. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice steady. And you should understand something. I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing it because I deserve better than this." Her tears came then, a torrent of emotion she could no longer hold back. But Ethan didn't waver. He had already cried his share of tears in the quiet moments when no one was watching. As Natalie signed her name, the finality of their situation settled over them both. When it was done, she placed the pen on the table and looked up at Ethan. "I'll never forgive myself," she said. Ethan met her gaze, his expression softening just slightly. "That's something you'll have to live with. I'll find my way, but you need to figure out yours." That night, Ethan packed the last of his belongings and left the house. The driveway felt longer than it ever had as he walked to his car, but as he drove away, he felt a strange sense of relief. The chapter with Natalie was closing, and for the first time in months, he felt the possibility of a new beginning waiting on the horizon. Ethan had always thought of endings as painful, but as the days turned into weeks after leaving his home, he began to understand they could also be transformative. The quiet of his new apartment felt like a balm, a space where he could begin to rebuild without the weight of Natalie's betrayal pressing down on him. It was small, minimalist, and unadorned, but it was his, a clean slate in every sense. The first few nights were the hardest. Ethan would sit on the balcony with a cup of coffee, staring out at the city lights, his mind replaying moments from his marriage. There were the good times, shared laughter, trips to the coast, quiet evenings spent watching old movies. But there were also the darker moments, ones he now recognized as signs of Natalie's drifting loyalty, her emotional distance, the way her laughter had started to sound different when she thought he wasn't listening. He didn't linger on those memories for long. Ethan wasn't one to wallow. Instead, he focused on small victories, reorganizing his schedule, getting back into running, and even picking up his guitar again, a hobby he'd neglected over the years. Music filled the emptiness of his apartment, each strum a reminder that he was still capable of creating something meaningful. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from Miriam. The divorce proceedings were finalized. "It's official," she said. "You're free." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Freedom. It felt bittersweet, like shedding a heavy coat on a cold day. "Thanks, Miriam," he said, "for everything." "You're welcome, Ethan, and just so you know, you handled this with more grace than most people would. Take some time for yourself. You've earned it." Taking her advice to heart, Ethan began leaning into the things that brought him joy. He reconnected with old friends, starting with a long overdue coffee date with his college buddy Mark. Over lattes and laughter, Ethan shared the broad strokes of what had happened, avoiding the darker details. "You know," Mark said, "it sounds like you've been through hell, but you're coming out of it stronger. Honestly, I don't know if I could have handled it the way you did." Ethan smiled. "I didn't feel strong at the time, but now I think I'm starting to see the other side." Mark's words stayed with him. Maybe he was stronger than he gave himself credit for. Ethan also found solace in his work. His colleagues noticed a renewed focus in him, a quiet determination that translated into better results. His manager pulled him aside one day, commending him on his performance. "It's good to see you hitting your stride again, Ethan," she said. "I'm just trying to keep moving forward," he replied, and it was the truth. Still, the wounds Natalie had left weren't completely healed. There were moments of doubt, flashes of anger, and pangs of loneliness. But Ethan allowed himself to feel them fully, knowing they were part of the process. He began journaling, pouring his thoughts onto paper in an attempt to untangle his emotions. The act was therapeutic, a way of giving his pain a voice without letting it control him. One evening, as he scrolled through social media, Ethan stumbled across a post from Natalie. She had shared a photo of a sunset with a caption about healing and growth. It was vague, but he recognized it for what it was, a reflection of her guilt. He didn't dwell on it. Instead, he closed the app and picked up his guitar, letting the music carry him into the night. Months later, Ethan stood in the park after a morning run, the crisp air filling his lungs. He looked around at the families, couples, and individuals enjoying the day, each lost in their own lives. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan wasn't weighed down by the past. He wasn't thinking about Natalie, Jared, or the home he'd left behind. He was simply present, existing in the moment. A woman jogging by accidentally bumped into him, jolting him from his thoughts. She stopped immediately, apologizing profusely. "Sorry about that," she said, her cheeks flushed. "It's fine," Ethan replied with a small smile. As she jogged away, he couldn't help but chuckle. Maybe there was room for new connections in his life after all. Walking back to his apartment, Ethan felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but he was learning to trust himself again, to find peace in the person he was becoming. Sometimes, he realized, the end of one chapter wasn't just an ending. It was also the start of something new.